Brett Ryan was weeks away from marrying the woman of his dreams. He had a waterfront condo, a good job, and a bright future, or so everyone thought. But when his mother threatened to expose his lies, he decided she had to die. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the true dark and mysterious tales, then make sure to like this video and subscribe, as it really helps out a beginner YouTube channel like myself. So without further ado, let's get into today's story. In 2007, when Brett was 26 years old, he found himself $60,000 in debt. He was living with his family in a large detached house on Conference Boulevard, not too far away from the Canadian metropolitan city, Toronto. And this was certainly not the life that he had imagined for himself. He spent time volunteering at the Sick Kids and also refereed small league games at the local community center. Brett was good-looking, generous, and made friends easily, as friends around him always told him that he was always polite and had a warm smile. After high school, he enrolled at the University of Toronto, but it was too much for him, so he ended up dropping out. While his best friends built reputable careers around finance, education, and health, Brett worked as a house painter, a summer job turned full-time gig. He went from job to job in his old Dodge Dakota with nothing but his worn paintbrush and his wide smile. But underneath that veneer, he was becoming a desperate young man. Rather than concede failure, he sought to patch over his problems with cash that wasn't his. On October 20, 2007, Brett robbed his first bank located about 8 minutes away from his home. And unbeknownst to anybody, this would be the beginning of the end. He wrapped his face in hospital bandages and hung his left arm in a sling and shuffled into the branch holding a sheaf of papers. At the counter, he handed a note to the teller indicating that he was carrying a gun under his sling and demanded $2,000 or more. The teller, being afraid of her life, quickly complied. However, Brett only received about $1,000. But he got away with it without getting caught. And from this day onwards, he was hooked. Over the next 8 months, he went on to rob another 12 more banks, and by the end of his bank robbing spree, he stole an amount of $28,000. And Brett owed his success to the fact that he was never arrested before. The police officers obtained fingerprints from the crime scenes, but no matches ever turned up in their system. At one point, they had 25 officers sitting outside the banks along the major highway for 3 weeks in hopes that the culprit might show up. Meanwhile, Brett embraced the theatricalities of his crimes. He was really enjoying his notoriety. After hitting a second bank with a bandage disguise, he got even more clever and upgraded his props and bought a high-quality glue-on beard at a costume supplier. The disguise ultimately earned him the nickname the Bearded Bandit. He also wore a Gilligan hat, glasses, a plaid shirt, and a dark jacket to enhance his disguise. After one of Brett's bank robberies, the police spotted his truck in an external camera and tracked him to his home, while Brett was completely oblivious. By the time he entered his last bank, the TD Canada Trust at 3115 Kingston Road, the police had been surveilling him for 2 weeks. However, he must have suspected something was up as he strided into the bank, then quickly turned around and walked out where the police were waiting for him. He was apprehended immediately and taken into custody. Brett was caught red-handed. With indisputable amount of evidence presented against him, he pleaded guilty and spent the next 7 months in custody awaiting trial. And soon after, on one frosty day of January 2009, Brett sat in a small windowless courtroom awaiting for his verdict. Several of his close friends had written letters of support detailing his generosity and volunteer work. The judge actually cited that Brett had a stellar background in his sentencing report. The judge remarked that Brett is a person who has integrity, who has given himself to his community, who has given himself to others, and who is truly a productive member of society. You are not a youth, but you, in my view, are youthful. The judge concluded that the crimes were completely out of character and only sentenced Brett to 5 years in jail. However, with time already served and early parole, he was back with his family in his home by late 2010, ready to start fresh. Outside the prison walls, Brett found a harsher world than the one he'd known before. He could no longer avoid his debt and filed for bankruptcy. He couldn't hide his past from his prospective employers who Googled him. He even tried to resume his house painting business, but most potential clients wouldn't let him into their homes when they learned about his record. And who could blame them? As he approached his 30th birthday, he couldn't escape the self-inflicted realities of his life. He was a bankrupt ex-con with high school education and no prospects. And his family, of course, was shocked and mortified by Brett's actions. Brett's father, Bill, worked as a budget manager at the Toronto Star, a local newspaper company in Toronto. Bill was quiet, health-conscious, teaching fitness classes at the local community center, but otherwise keeping to himself. Brett's mother, Sue, was bubbly yet firm, a tough homemaker, and a lifelong gardener. She was also a die-hard baseball fan. When her beloved Toronto Blue Jays won the World Series in 1993, she marched up and down the street banging pots and pans. And of course, Brett, he was the third of 4 brothers. The eldest, Chris, worked as a public transit fare collector. He was shy in public but showed his goofy side to those who knew him well. Then came Lyland, the artistic one, who was 2.5 years older than Brett. He played guitar and drums, studied photography at Ryerson University, and restored vintage cabinets. The youngest, AJ, was 6 years Brett's junior. He stood out for his intellect as he excelled so highly academically that his parents sent him to a school for gifted students. Brett's friends and neighbors remember him as the outgoing jock of the bunch, an extrovert in a family of introverts. He suffered periodic bouts of depression, though he preferred to keep his problems to himself. He wanted to project an image of strength and positivity. He wanted to be admired, not pitied. However, the news of Brett's recent crime spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Sue, Brett's mother, was bothered by the fact that their neighbors gossiped about her family and remarked that this neighborhood was bad luck. Eventually, she and Bill sold their large home and bought a small bungalow on Lawndale Road in Scarborough, a smaller city next to Toronto. The Ryans made the most of their new home. Sue set about transforming the front yard into an elaborate display garden with flowering perennials, small shrubs, and a statue of a cat. The project took her 6 years to complete, and despite her arthritis, she was out working almost every warm day. The whole time, she kept Brett's history a secret from the neighbors. Lawndale was a quiet street, and a familiar calm settled over the Ryans' lives. Brett knuckled down and started taking the steps that in time could help him achieve the success he envisioned for himself. He worked low-paying retail jobs, and with some financial help from his parents, he was able to re-enroll in the University of Toronto to pursue a degree in biophysics. He even visited a psychologist who told him that the chief lesson of his robberies was that if he wanted to avoid future troubles, he needed to be transparent and honest to those closest to him, and Brett agreed. After about 2 years into their new reconstructing lifestyle, in September 2011, a friend set Brett up on a blind date with Kristen Baxter, an athletic blonde physiotherapist. They met for the first time at the corner of a prominent downtown street, not far from her waterfront condo. Kristen lived the kind of blissful, normal life that Brett wanted for himself. She had a good job and a nice home. She liked hiking and traveling and walking her fluffy poodle mix around Harborfront. Her demure smile perfectly matched his delirious grin. They really did look like a picture-perfect couple. Kristen even knew about Brett's criminal past, but his history didn't stop her from falling in love with him. In January 2013, he moved into a condo located in the heart of downtown Toronto. The glassy downtown tower was a drastic change from his family's suburban bungalow. Kristen's condo was small, only about 549 square feet, but it offered a gorgeous view of the lake beyond the Toronto Islands. Brett could barbecue on the roof, watch the planes land at Billy Bishop Airport, and swim in the indoor-outdoor pool on the second floor. They even traveled frequently, visiting tropical locations. They were really living their life, and it almost seemed too good to be true. Roughly a year after Brett moved in with Kristen, his father unfortunately had passed away. Brett took care of his mom Sue, helping her with some of the administrative tasks that Bill had once handled, and also performing odd jobs around the house for extra cash. He needed the money. Why? Because Brett had recently proposed to Kristen with a princess-cut diamond surrounded by a halo of smaller diamonds. And once again, his finances were unraveling and crumbling, and as his bank account foundered, he began to build a web of lies. In 2015, he dropped out of school again, but he didn't tell his fiancée. Kristen and his family believed that he was still pursuing his studies, but slowly but surely, things were falling apart. However, in the early spring of 2016, Brett caught a lucky break and got a job at a local Toronto tech firm. And at last, it looked like he finally would escape the low-wage work and start earning some real income. He sincerely hoped that with this new job, he would potentially accelerate his success and recover from the state that he is in before his lies were exposed. He celebrated his victory with Kristen and his family, but within days of hiring him, the inevitable occurred. His new employer discovered his previous life as the bearded bandit. The company promptly rescinded his offer, and again, rather than admit defeat, he let his family go on believing that he still had a job. He couldn't afford to disappoint them again, and was determined to perform the lies every day if need be. Meanwhile, Brett and Kristen were planning their wedding for September 16, 2016, right around their anniversary of their first date in 2011. They were going to be married at Ancaster Mill, a rustic creekside venue near Toronto with almost $100 plated service per person. Brett planned a bachelor weekend in August with the boys, and the agenda for his marriage was being carried out regardless of Brett's crumbling life. Meanwhile, Kristen hoped to move on from their tiny condo after the wedding as Kristen actively sought help from a realtor and started looking for a house to purchase. And the house that they would never be able to purchase. Ironically, Brett was making his mother proud. Sue, being oblivious, often bragged about Brad's successes to their neighbors. She told them about his university degree, his good job, his condo downtown, and his upcoming wedding. However, at the same time, Brett was relying more heavily on her for help. And with so many financial demands on the horizon, he pressed her more for jobs around the house for extra cash. Sue did what she could do for him. He was her son after all. She was quite grateful that he had come so far. Even with his mother's help, Brett's situation was becoming dire. Less than a month before the wedding, after a year of piling lie upon lie, Brett finally followed his psychologist's advice. He told his mother the truth about what was really going on. He knew he had to get a job, but he needed her support until that happened, and instead of receiving the usual bailout from his mom, he received an ultimatum. Either tell his fiancée Kristen everything, or Sue would do it herself. She'd give him no more money until he came clean. However, for Brett, telling Kristen the truth was the worst possible scenario. She might leave him, and then he'd be forced to return home to the little house on Lawndale with his mother and brothers. He'd be destitute, a disgrace, reliving a history of failure that he thought seemed terribly unfair for a nice guy who always did everything for others. He was too close to achieving his dream life. He wasn't going to allow his mother to drag him down. And so, he decided he was going to kill her. And in order for this deed to be carried out, Brett decided that he needed a weapon. However, the conditions of his previous sentencing made it illegal for him to purchase a firearm. And so, he purchased a crossbow, which does not require a license and can be purchased by anyone over the age of 18. After many days of researching, he chose a Barnett Recruit U30, one of the cheapest and lightest crossbows available in Canada. On Amazon, it could be purchased for around $300, but Brett bought his second-hand in order to avoid leaving a potentially incriminating record of the purchase. In the days after the ultimatum, Brett continued to visit his mother's home to work on renovation projects. And during one of those trips, he acted normally as he stashed his crossbow in the garage behind some tools on a top shelf. He and his brothers had recently renovated their mother's kitchen, and the garage was an absolute mess with old flooring heaped up into the center. No one was going to be poking around the clutter, and it was a perfect place to hide his weapons. August 25th, 2016 was a sweltering day with high humidity and thunderstorms. In the morning, Brett and Kristen got ready for work. She at her physiotherapy practice, and he at his imaginary job at a tech company. The sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows when Kristen left the residence at approximately 7:30 a.m. in the morning. When she was gone, Brett got to work building a device that he had hoped would provide an alibi if he was ever accused of the crimes that he was about to commit. He was an intelligent guy. He just never used his intelligence the right way. First, he opened his laptop and propped it against the wall with two 5-pound weights. Then, he duct taped a wooden spoon to a black cylindrical oscillating fan and placed it so the tip of the spoon lined up with the laptop's enter key. He plugged the cord into a digital timer like the kind used for Christmas lights. When the timer activated, the fan would turn and the spoon would click on a cursor hovering over an icon that would open YouTube. Next, he took two more portable fans also plugged into digital timers and screwed them to a wooden board, which he placed on the granite countertop of the kitchen island. He taped styluses to the castings of the fans. Then, Brett screwed a smartphone and a tablet to another wooden board so that the screens faced the fans. When the timers went off, the fans would turn, the styluses would tap the phone and the tablet, and each would send out a pre-typed message, one thanking a friend for a real estate tip and the other about home repair. The timers were rigged to go off at various points throughout the afternoon, and the devices were set so they wouldn't go to sleep while he was away. Brett designed all of this to leave a digital trace that the police would triangulate to his home. No matter what happened that day, he will be able to say that he stayed home the entire time watching YouTube videos and sending emails, the perfect alibi for a digital age. Later in the day, despite the blistering heat, Brett put on 2 pairs of jeans before leaving the house. He packed his gym bag with a familiar disguise kit, some spare clothing, a wig, and a bucket hat, just like the kind he'd worn for his bank robberies. And in order for his elaborate alibi to work, Brett needed to leave his condo building without showing up in any of the security footages in the elevators, lobby, and the parking area. That left him with only one route: 14 flights down the stairwell and out through the back alley. There were a few cameras out there too, but he'd already eyeballed where they were and pointed and planned a path to duck them. When he strategically left the alley, he headed towards the local bus terminal, took a train to Eglinton Station, and walked 10 minutes to his mother's home. He arrived at 10 Lawndale Road around 10 a.m., and Brett's mother Sue was not expecting him to show up that morning. She had actually just cancelled her plans to go to the CNE, which is a massive carnival held by the city, with her neighbor Mary, and unfortunately, Sue had caught a cold and decided not to go. Brett was hoping that his mother Sue would see his perspective, but when Brett ignited the conversation, Sue held her ground, promising to tell Kristen everything if Brett did not. In a matter of minutes, the argument got heated, to the point where Sue had to call her eldest son Chris to come over here to handle his brother. Brett quickly realized that the situation was getting away from him, and so he marched out the back door and into the garage. And unfortunately, Sue followed him. Now, crossbows in nature are difficult to load, and with only a few steps from the house to the garage, Brett didn't have enough time to cock the string and fit a bolt in place before his mother entered the garage. And so instead, he grabbed a broadhead bolt with 3 sharp serrated blades that form a point and stabbed her in the cheek and the ear. Then he wrestled her to the ground behind a pile of hardwood flooring left over from the kitchen renovations. As she struggled, some of the flooring fell on top of her. He took a piece of yellow nylon rope and strangled her until she died. After Brett stabbed and strangled his mother to death, he set about cocking his crossbow. He knew his brother Chris was on the way, and he needed to be prepared. He braced the crossbow nose down on the ground and inserted the ball of his foot into the stirrup to hold it in place. Then he prepared a simple cocking device: 2 hooks that attached to the strings on either side of the barrel, and small handles just above the hooks for pulling the string up to the firing mechanism. A crossbow is rather a simple implement. Anyone can learn to shoot with reasonable accuracy with the help of a YouTube video and a few minutes of practice. When Chris came into the garage, Brett stepped up quietly behind him and fired at a very close range. The 3 blades went through Chris's neck and lodged in his mouth. Brett barely had to squeeze the trigger. All it needed was a light touch, and his brother died immediately. By this point, the gravel and sawdust floor of the garage was muddy with blood. Brett grabbed his brother's body and stacked it on top of his mother's behind a heap of hardwood flooring, then draped a tarp over them. If only he had time, he would have stuffed his bloody outer jeans into his gym bag and donned the wig and the Gilligan hat that he packed for this scenario. But before he could do any of that, his youngest brother AJ arrived home. Brett exited the garage and met AJ on the walkway to the back door. He was carrying another crossbow bolt in his fist, and by this point, he realized that he had gone too far down this nightmarish path to not see it through. He had to get rid of everyone. They grappled and Brett stabbed AJ in the neck. He collapsed onto the driveway immediately, and Brett's 3rd brother, Leyland, had been napping in his bedroom. He heard the altercation and went outside to see what was going on, and when he saw his younger brother bleeding on the ground, he ran to the phone to call 911. Brett instinctively followed him into the house and attacked him. What ensued was a ghastly struggle for survival. The 2 brothers stumbled chaotically throughout the house, down the hallways into different bedrooms, fighting and kicking over furniture as they went. They snapped an end table and threw each other against Leyland's bedroom door. Brett was soaked with the blood of his family members, and Leyland had suffered a head wound and bled profusely. As they fought, they left a trail of blood on the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Meanwhile, AJ managed to crawl down the driveway and out towards the street. He'd made it as far as the front of the house when Leyland escaped from his brother, ran towards the driveway, and found his younger brother AJ still alive, bleeding profusely in the driveway. With Brett in pursuit, Leyland ran across the street to get help from his mother's friends Warren and Mary. He hammered on the neighbor's door, and when Warren answered, Leyland tumbled into his arms and whispered, "Call 911. My brother's bleeding in the driveway. Make sure the police come." After relaying his message, Leyland promptly passed out. Meanwhile, feeling defeated, Brett got a bottle of water from the fridge. He didn't bother shutting the fridge door as he returned to the front stoop. He was waiting there calmly when the police arrived. AJ was still alive when the first responding officers came to the scene, but he ultimately succumbed to his injuries before the paramedics arrived. Shortly after Brett was apprehended, police entered Kristen's condo where they discovered the homemade alibi devices. They say the devices were functioning properly and would have worked if they hadn't assembled them. However, their report contradicted Brett's version of events. He told prosecutors that he had experienced a change of heart after assembling the alibi devices, and that he had not activated them before leaving the house to confront his mother. He was convicted of second-degree murder and the death of his mother. He claimed that during the argument, he walked to the garage to get the crossbow to threaten her and not to kill her. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder for his older brother Chris's death, since he had hidden and waited for his brother to arrive before executing him. And for AJ, he was convicted of second-degree murder since the victim had shown up unexpectedly. At his sentencing, Brett addressed the court. He sniffled through his tears, with his voice wavering. He said, "I can only begin to say how sorry I am for what I've done. I was sick with grief. The time now doesn't belong to me, but I'll make most of every opportunity I'm afforded. To everyone for all of this, I am very sorry." The judge remarked that he has no hesitation that Brett is remorseful for his actions. Brett received concurrent life sentences for each of the murders, plus 10 years for the attempted murder of Lyland. He will be eligible for parole in 2041, by which point he will be 60 years old. Leyland Ryan, Brett's sole surviving brother, told the court what it was like seeing his entire family get annihilated by his own brother. He described a life shattered by trauma as he suffers from severe anxiety. He can barely even leave the house. He can hardly sleep or concentrate. But above all, he thinks about his little brother AJ, taking his last breath and bleeding